Thomas Welker returned to Briarton County in the autumn of 1891, 34 years after his family had left. He came alone, by rail to Milford Junction, then by hired wagon along roads that no longer resembled the paths of his childhood. The driver, a man named Parnell, accepted his fare, but said little beyond directions. When Thomas mentioned he was born near Briarton, Parnell's hands tightened on the reins, and he did not ask further. The county records office stood at the edge of what remained of the town. A collection of weathered storefronts, a church with a crooked steeple, and houses set back from the road as if retreating from something. Thomas had written ahead, requesting access to land deeds and census records from the 1850s. The clerk, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Adelaide Crane, had prepared a small table for him in the back room. "You're looking for family records?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "My father owned property here. Welker, Samuel Welker." Mrs. Crane nodded slowly. She brought him a ledger, the pages brittle and stained. The Welker tract was sold in 1858. To the county. No record of transfer to another party. Thomas opened the ledger. His father's signature appeared once, dated March 1851, when the land had been purchased. Then nothing until the sale notation 7 years later. No deaths recorded, no litigation, just the word forfeited written in faded ink. "Do you remember the family?" he asked. Mrs. Crane returned to her desk. She did not look at him when she spoke. "I was a child then, but people remember. What do they remember?" She hesitated, her pen hovering over a document she was copying. "That your family left in the night, that others did the same around that time. And that no one spoke of why." Thomas had been 6 years old when they departed. His memories of Briarton were fragmented, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of his mother singing, the long silences between his parents in the weeks before they left. His father had died in Ohio 12 years later, never having returned. His mother lived still, in a boarding house in Cleveland, but when Thomas had asked her about Briarton, she had turned her face to the wall and said only, there was nothing good left there. He spent the afternoon examining records. 11 families had left between 1856 and 1859. Most had been landowners, modest farms and timber lots along the northern stretch of the county. The departures were irregular, spread across seasons, but they shared a pattern. No disputes, no debts, no official reason. Properties were abandoned or sold at fractions of their value. Some families left forwarding addresses, others vanished entirely from documentation. That evening, Thomas took a room at the Briarton Inn, a narrow building that smelled of damp wood and old tobacco. The innkeeper, a man named Horace Pruitt, was courteous but distant. When Thomas mentioned he was researching his family's history, Pruitt's expression went carefully blank. "That's your right," he said, "though I don't know what you'll find that matters now. Did you know my father, Samuel Welker?" Pruitt set down the key he'd been holding. "I knew who he was. Everyone did back then. Why did he leave?" The innkeeper looked past Thomas, toward the darkened street beyond the window. "Same reason everyone left. Because staying felt worse." The next morning, Thomas walked north from the town center. The road narrowed after the first mile, becoming rutted and overgrown. The trees pressed close on both sides, oak and maple, their leaves beginning to turn. He carried with him a map he'd found in the county records, hand-drawn and dated 1854. It showed the major properties along the northern road, including the Welker farm at the 4-mile mark. The land had changed. What had once been cleared fields were now dense with second-growth timber. Old fence posts jutted from the underbrush, their rails long rotted away. He passed 2 abandoned farmhouses, their roofs collapsed and walls leaning. No attempt had been made to reclaim them. They stood as they'd been left, windows empty, doors hanging open. At 3.5 miles the road split. One branch continued north, fading into the forest. The other turned east, toward what the map labeled as the Calder property. Thomas chose the northern route. The Welker house no longer existed. He found the foundation, a rectangle of moss-covered stone, and the remnants of a barn that had burned. The chimney still stood, blackened and solitary. He walked the perimeter of what had been the yard, kicking at weeds that had grown waist-high. In the soil near the foundation he found a child's toy, a wooden horse carved by hand, its paint mostly worn away. He recognized it. His father had made it for him. He'd left it behind. He stood there for a long time, holding the toy, trying to reconstruct memory from the ruins. But nothing came except the silence of the forest and the sound of wind moving through empty spaces. That afternoon, he returned to the records office. Mrs. Crane was sorting through old newspapers, their pages yellowed and fragile. She glanced up when he entered, but said nothing. "I found the property," Thomas said. "There's nothing left." No, there wouldn't be. He sat down at the table she'd prepared for him. "I need to understand what happened. I was too young to remember clearly, but I know it wasn't normal. My father never explained. My mother refused to speak of it." Mrs. Crane set down the newspaper she'd been holding. She studied him with an expression that was neither kind nor unkind, simply weighing something. "You were 6 when you left?" "Yes." "Then you wouldn't remember the road." "Which road?" She walked to the window looking out toward the street. "The one everyone crossed, the one no one spoke about." Thomas waited. Mrs. Crane continued without turning. "It wasn't a road, really, just a stretch of the northern path, between the 3-mile and 5-mile markers. People used it because they had to. It was the only route to the farms beyond. But sometime in the early 1850s, people stopped talking when they crossed it. They stopped looking around. They hurried through as if something waited there." "What waited there?" "Nothing. That's what made it worse." She turned to face him. "Nothing ever happened on that road. No attacks, no accidents, no bodies found. But people began to believe something should happen there. That if they lingered or spoke or acknowledged it, something would." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "That's superstition." "Of course it is. But superstition doesn't explain why families left, or why the land stayed empty after." She returned to her desk, opening a drawer. There was a girl, Eliza Morse. She was 17 in 1854. She wrote letters to her cousin in Pennsylvania. 3 of them survive. "I have copies." She handed him the letters. The handwriting was precise, the language formal, in the way of educated rural women of that era. Thomas read them slowly. The first, dated June 1854, was ordinary: news of weather, family health, community events. The second, from September of the same year, was shorter and more constrained. Eliza mentioned that her father had forbidden her from walking the northern road alone. She did not explain why. The third letter, dated December 1854, was 4 sentences long. "Dearest Margaret, I am well, though our family has decided to leave Briarton by spring. Father says the land no longer suits us. I cannot write more of this. Please remember me kindly." She never wrote again, Mrs. Crane said. The Morse family moved to Ohio in March 1855. They were the first to go. Thomas set down the letters. What started it? This fear of the road? No one knows, or no one said. Mrs. Crane pulled another document from the drawer, a page torn from a ledger book. But there was an incident in 1852. It's mentioned in the church records. A man named Caleb Voss disappeared. The entry was brief. Caleb Voss, age 38, noted absent from congregation. Family states he departed on foot to Milford Junction, 22nd September 1852. Did not arrive. Search conducted without result. Voss was a farmer, Mrs. Crane continued. He lived near the 5-mile mark. His wife told the pastor he'd left early in the morning to sell grain in Milford. He never reached the town. No one saw him on the road. His body was never found. People disappear, Thomas said. Accidents happen. Yes, but Caleb Voss was known to be reliable. He'd made that journey dozens of times, and his wife said something strange when the pastor asked if her husband had any troubles. She said, "He was afraid of the quiet on that road. He said it felt like something listening." Thomas studied the church record. The handwriting was different from the ledgers, more hurried, less formal. Whoever had written this entry had done so with reluctance. After Voss disappeared, Mrs. Crane said, people began to avoid the road at certain hours, dawn and dusk mostly. They said the light played tricks there, shadows that moved wrong, sounds that didn't match the wind. But again, nothing tangible, nothing anyone could point to and say, there, that's the danger. So people frightened themselves. Perhaps. Mrs. Crane's voice was neutral, but fear doesn't usually empty an entire settlement, not without cause. Over the following days, Thomas interviewed those who would speak with him. Most were reluctant. When he mentioned the northern road, conversations stalled or redirected. He learned to approach the subject obliquely, through questions about old property boundaries or family histories. He spoke with Martin Schaefer, now 78, who had operated a sawmill near the town in the 1850s. Schaefer remembered the departures. They didn't talk about it, he said, sitting on the porch of his daughter's house. But you could see it in them, the way they looked over their shoulders, the way they stopped using that stretch of road unless they had to. Did you ever feel it yourself? Whatever they feared? Schaefer was quiet for a long time. I crossed that road every week for 20 years, never had trouble. But I'll tell you this, after the Voss disappearance, I never crossed it alone if I could help it. And I never stopped walking once I started. Why not? Because the silence there felt wrong, like it was waiting for something to fill it. Thomas spoke with Rachel Denton, a woman in her 60s whose family had remained in Briarton. Her father had owned land adjacent to the Welker property. My father sold his land in 1857, she said. He wouldn't say why, but I remember him telling my mother that he couldn't work soil where he was afraid to look up. Afraid of what? Of seeing something. Or of not seeing something, but knowing it was there. Rachel's hands folded and unfolded in her lap. I was a child. I didn't understand. But I remember the tension in the house, the way my parents stopped letting us play outside after a certain hour, the way my father wouldn't let us mention the Voss name, or ask questions about the families who left. Did your family cross that road? We had to, sometimes. But my father made us sing when we did. Hymns, usually. He said it kept our minds occupied. Thomas found similar stories repeated across his interviews, fragments of inherited fear, rules created to manage dread, the slow constriction of normal life around an unnamed thing. But nowhere could he find evidence of actual harm. No bodies, no violence, only absence. He returned to the northern road in late afternoon, carrying a lantern though it was still light. He wanted to stand at the center of the stretch between the 3-mile and 5-mile markers and understand what had been felt there. The road was empty. The trees had grown dense enough that their canopies overlapped, creating a tunnel of foliage that blocked much of the sky. The light was muted, greenish, filtered through layers of leaves. His footsteps were loud against the packed earth. At what he estimated was the 4-mile point, near where his family's land had been, he stopped walking. The silence was profound. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. The wind that had been present elsewhere seemed to die here, as if the air itself was holding still. Thomas forced himself to remain motionless. He counted to 100, then 200. Nothing changed. No sound emerged. No movement caught his eye. The forest simply stood around him, dense and indifferent. And yet, there was a quality to the stillness that felt deliberate, as if the absence of sound was not natural, but imposed, as if the space had been emptied of noise not by coincidence, but by design. He tried to dismiss the sensation. Forests were often quiet. The time of day, the season, the density of growth, all these could explain the silence. But his father's voice came to him unbidden, a memory from the journey away from Briarton. Some places remember what happened in them, not in the ground or the trees, in the people who passed through. Thomas walked the remaining distance to the 5-mile marker without stopping. When he reached the place where the road widened again and the trees thinned, he felt a physical sense of relief that embarrassed him. That evening, he found a journal in the county archives, a slim volume kept by Reverend Isaiah Pritchard, who had served the Briarton Church from 1848 to 1860. Most entries were mundane: baptisms, marriages, attendance records. But in September 1854, 2 years after Voss's disappearance, the Reverend had written something longer. "I am troubled by the state of our congregation. Good people are leaving without cause that can be spoken. When I inquire, they offer excuses: better land elsewhere, family obligations, health, but their eyes betray them. They are fleeing something they cannot name. Today, Hiram Welker came to me in private. He asked if there was sin specific to a place, if land itself could be corrupted not by what occurred upon it, but by what was believed of it. I told him that belief shapes our souls, not the ground beneath our feet. But I wonder now if I was wrong. If the thoughts of many concentrated on one place can make that place dangerous, not through supernatural means, but through the fear that gathers there like water in a depression." Hiram did not seem comforted. He left without taking communion. Thomas read the passage 3 times. Hiram Welker had been his grandfather, Samuel's father. He died in 1856, 2 years before the family left. There was no record of his death in the church books, which suggested he'd died elsewhere or been buried without ceremony. He searched for more entries about the Welker family, but found only one, dated March 1857. "Samuel Welker has asked me to pray for his father's soul, though he will not say why this prayer is needed." I agreed, but Samuel's distress suggests something beyond ordinary grief. "I fear this community is poisoning itself with silence." Thomas stayed in Briarton for 2 weeks. He walked the northern road daily, each time pushing himself to remain longer in the silent stretch. He found no explanation that satisfied reason. The land was ordinary. The road was ordinary. Whatever had happened there existed only in the minds of those who had feared it. But the effects of that fear were measurable. 11 families displaced, land abandoned, a community fragmented, all because of something that might never have existed outside belief. On his last day, he visited his family's old property one final time. He stood at the foundation of the house and tried to imagine his father's life here. The daily work, the isolation, the slow accumulation of dread that finally became unbearable. He buried the wooden horse he'd found, placing it back into the soil near where he thought his childhood room might have been. It seemed important to return it. As he walked back to town, he thought about his mother's refusal to speak of Briarton, about the letters she'd burned the year after his father died, without letting Thomas read them, about the way she'd flinched whenever anyone mentioned moving back to rural land. The fear had followed them, not because the road was dangerous, but because they'd believed it was. And belief was harder to escape than any physical place. Thomas Welker left Briarton on October 18, 1891. He wrote a brief report of his findings for the County Historical Society, noting the abandoned properties and the pattern of departures in the 1850s. He did not mention the road. He did not mention his conversations with the remaining residents. He described only the documented facts, dates, names, property transfers. The report was filed and largely forgotten. The northern road remained empty. Second-growth forest reclaimed the old farms. The last of the original families died or moved away. By 1920, no one in Briarton remembered the specific details of what had been feared, only that something once was. In 1935, the northern road was improved and incorporated into a county highway. The stretch between what had been the 3-mile and 5-mile markers was paved and widened. Houses were built along it. Children played in yards that overlooked the route. Nothing unusual occurred. But in the county archives, preserved in acid-free boxes, remain 3 letters from Eliza Morse, a journal kept by Reverend Pritchard, and a brief report written by Thomas Welker. These documents describe no monster, no crime, no tangible threat. They describe only the way fear can take root in a place and grow until it becomes indistinguishable from reality. And they describe a road that everyone crossed without speaking, because silence felt safer than acknowledging what might not have been there at all.